Hey, Alysa, how are you?
Hi, on this rainy day in DC.
Oh, it's not raining here. So this background is how I'm feeling. It reflects what it's like outside.
All right. Well, I wish I could pull a little bit of your pink into my background.
We're supposed to talk about the IAPP conference last week, but I dare you not to talk about the federal privacy bill.
I double dare you not to
I can't
talk
do
about
it.
the federal privacy bill.
I can't do it. I have to talk about it. Here's the funny thing. I've talked to everybody about it except for you, and that's totally weird. You were actually the first person that told me about it. They dropped it on Friday, right?
We
Their
got
last
it
one.
leaked on that it was going to drop on Friday.
Yeah. What's up with this Friday thing, by the way?
This is how things roll. This is
Is it?
Washington. Well, I can't say Washington because California does it too. Friday, end of the day, drop some news.
Is that it's on purpose?
I think so.
I actually think it's pretty cool that they're doing it. It's so interesting that nobody talked about a federal privacy law. The odds were super low, 20, 30%, and then they're like, actually, everybody, here's what we've been doing. I'd love your take on it. It feels like it's like all the strictest pieces of California and Washington, my health, my data. And I don't know if that's designed to stay in there or bargaining chips that get diluted down? Like what's your key thoughts?
Well, gosh, I have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah.
It's fraught, right? The last time that there was the proposed federal privacy bill, it also was kind of carefully, tightly balanced, based to have the right supporters, and it failed. And so this one is somewhat separately balanced, but that balance was pretty important. And you have some who really like it. And of course, many who are saying there's some issues, there's some real problems with it. So I'm still skeptical that this gets over the finish line. I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer. I have to be come with a grain of salt. But it's a tight timing. There's still a lot of components to this bill that I don't know if it's enough to get the votes that they would need. I will just say, just to be clear, you mentioned my health, my data. It does not preempt my health, my data. So health privacy laws still continue to exist outside of this law. And there's other private right of actions, like we've talked about all those pixel suits, that's not preempted. But what this would do, the silver lining is to have one federal standard for the comprehensive privacy laws, your CCPAs, as it relates to consumer data, not employee data, not B2B data. And I agree with you, it goes farther, right? Like they are focusing on first party data, advertising, targeted advertising outside the environment. They use different terms, but they really are talking about those relationships with making available. They took California's definition, making available, transferring data to other parties. So I think you can't not read this and say highly regulated. Either way we look at it, privacy is a highly regulated space at this point.
I love I've been obsessed lately with just types of data. When we did a consumer study, as you know, a couple of years ago, and one of the findings was, a lot of people highly value their data privacy. And since then, different conversations we've been having, folks are like, well, some people can, some people don't. And they kind of it became a segment thing, like different segments of the population care about privacy. I actually think that's wrong. I think everybody has a threshold when they start to care. And for example, the New York Times LexisNexis automotive article was a tipping point, I think, for an indicator that consumers really care about this and companies are going to change their practices outside of what a regulator is doing. I mean, just from this New York Times article. And so I think as you hit different types of data, health data, whatnot, like there was an opt-in for sensitive and personal, I thought I saw in this federal bill.
Yeah.
It's still an opt-out for advertising. I thought that was an interesting, like, hey, we're going to do both. Because one of the things I liked about the bill was the obligations felt like they're getting pushed closer to business. And what I'm really saying is this whole idea of opt-in consent is informed consent. I just never liked that. And so this idea of the folks that are in there, businesses in there with data practices should be the ones thinking about data minimization and transparency. I really like that about the bill. Am I being naive? Is that the right way to think about it?
Well, I mean, the data minimization, transparency, these are concepts we've seen in all of the different privacy frameworks. I think one of the things that's fairly interesting here is, there's the fear factor of litigation, right? There's a lot of different enforcers here, including the private right of action, but there is the kind of at least the proposed arc of a compliance framework that the FTC might approve. And then if you audit to that, essentially, if you're in compliance with that framework, that's your safe harbor, right? That's your defense when you get these suits. In theory, that's progress. Now, the FTC does not have a great track record of approving lots of compliance frameworks, like even the COPPA frameworks, like that's a fairly long drawn out process, and we don't have too many new ones added to that list. So it's a tall order, but I think if there are the right incentives there, it at least gives clarity, right? Like what things do companies need to do specifically to be in compliance, as opposed to we have a lot of gray. And I don't know that this statute accomplishes that or necessarily we'd see that with the FTC, but I think that's at least moving in a positive direction for clarity.
It's at least more of a real privacy law, even though it's not perfect.
It's something that one could benchmark against to know whether they are in compliance.
Gotcha.
There's always this tension between having laws that hyper prescriptive regulate, because then it's really hard to innovate, right? That particularly with technology, that becomes outdated like the second it's published. So there's like that versus wide, unfair and deceptive, which we say, well, how does a company know to design their practices so that it's definitely not unfair and deceptive? And that's a moving target. We learn from these FTC enforcements over time. So having a framework, right? Like I think the closest framework we have in some ways is the more specific state privacy laws, like your CCPA with regulations. But that is also a moving target because these regulations, and then there's new regulations, and then we're still trying to figure out, we haven't had a landing spot on what a compliant program looks like. So I think if we can get to agreement on what is 1.0 compliant privacy program in the US, that helps all companies know what they need to build against to. I just think we're always going to have trouble with like smaller companies, medium-sized companies, depending on the company itself and what it needs to do.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well, Alysa, the $40 million revenue threshold and the 200,000 people threshold.
Just quickly on that, like the small business thing, that's to avoid undue burden. But I think if you're a small business, there's also like if you're getting, you want to get investors, you want to potentially get acquired, like diligence is going to want to see your privacy compliant. So it's really hard to like build a thriving business, I think, and be agnostic to privacy requirements. Some of this really starts with like before you start collecting the data. So yes and no.
Oh, no, I'm with you. Well, yeah, and I mean, I think this that it's not just about this regulation. You should be doing this because consumers care, and so just because if the regulation says small businesses don't have to comply, it doesn't mean don't do it. And if we've reached this tipping point with consumers, then even more reason to do it. I want to ask you about the dark patterns piece. I thought that was interesting.
It absolutely, yeah. What's marketing versus dark patterns, right? We are trying to nudge behavior when you are marketing to somebody, right? You want to persuade them to purchase that, but not in a deceptive way. Like that is unfair and deceptive trade practices. So this seems to move the line a bit. And so we ask for parity, but I think there's gonna be a lot of battles over that going forward. And you could say the regulators will exercise their discretion. I don't know on the private right of action side that they're going to exercise as much discretion. Yes, this framework would you need to have actual injury, it's got to be substantial injury, but that does not stop plaintiffs' lawyers from sending demand letters or, so a lot to be seen.
I had a feeling we were going to talk about that. So on the private right of action, there was a part of me that thought, okay, hey, this is a great weapon for consumers and at least gives them a voice. But I know it comes with a cost, right? The plaintiff's bar and all that kind of business. Like, how do you think about it? Like, do you think the benefits outweigh the cost of having a private right of action, or do you think it creates too much silliness?
I just know over the years, I look at BIPA, I look at these pixel suits, how much money is spent and how much of it goes to plaintiffs' lawyers, as opposed to what could go into compliance related infrastructure, people managing compliance. And so like the incentives are a little off. Like I really wish there could be some reasonable cap in structure. So like, yes, you have that deterrent factor, but it doesn't really just suck all the resources, right? I mean, it motivates certainly more spending because it's an exposure area. And so I can see the silver lining that a regulator would look at as to why that catalyst is important. But compliance usually doesn't have enough resources to begin with. So that I have some concerns there.
Who are the typical groups, Alysa, that like rally against private rights actions in bills?
Well, pretty much most businesses, because they deal with, I mean, there's a lot of what we would say is frivolous lawsuits with no harm whatsoever that are just, they
Right.
get all the time.
What else did you think was cool? What else did you
Well,
like or not like
Senator
about it?
Cantwell was kind of a big dividing line in the past with federal privacy legislation. So the fact that she was a co-sponsor here and got behind this, I think that was really notable because it means some version is she saw a lot of the complaints that she had before that the federal standard was not robust enough, that she's getting behind a federal standard. And so, you know, an open question then are like, can the areas where folks are not in agreement, at least in terms of the votes, I wonder whether there's enough there now, or at least at sometime soon. We've got a lot of retirements as well. So anytime you throw in new people, then that throws like the votes up in the air. So we'll see if it doesn't happen this session. Who are the new players? You know, who's going to put something forward?
Yeah, so I think I told you I was talking to one of the sponsors of the Vermont data privacy bill, and I asked like, what happens if a federal privacy bill comes along? It was before all this, and I said the reason we're doing this is because there isn't one. Like we'd love one, and I never
Right.
quite appreciated that. And states are moving forward because there isn't a federal privacy bill, and maybe this just solves a lot of that and makes it easier for everybody.
Yeah, well, states would enforce. I mean, they would
Right.
still have enforcement powers. We already heard from California not happy with this federal standard and
Was that
thought
right?
that it
Why?
should be,
No.
yeah, no, there was criticism. It similar to what they had in terms of the last bill that was put forward, but the view that it should be a floor and not a ceiling, and that they are doing a whole lot. They can move more nimbly.
Mm.
So, you know, those are pretty vocal stakeholders who are coming out against, and that can sway, you know, certain other stakeholders. So it'll be interesting to watch.
So when I read the federal privacy bill, it seemed like it had everything California had, or it felt just as strict. Is that not right? Is there areas where
Well,
California
I
goes
mean, just think
further?
of all their rulemaking, like all of the topics that they are tackling in their rulemaking. It's not necessarily addressed in this statute because it's a statute.
Mhm.
So that's a decent question. I will note though, this is version 3 of this federal privacy bill. Like since Friday leaking, we've seen 3 different versions. And so there are definitely components here that are still very much in progress as there's feedback coming in.
Gotcha. When do you think we get a decision on this? Like, is it some kind of timeline or no?
Well, the timeline is like, let's see until the end of the session. They've got a hearing on it next week. It seems to be like the cornerstone of that hearing with some other bills also being discussed. So I think it's really, is there momentum? What does it look like at the House side? What does it look like at the state side? Who are big, you know, vocal stakeholders that come out pro, that come out against? So it will be, I think, somewhat of an adding the votes at the end of the day.
Gotcha. And do you think, the last question, do you think the election has anything to do with timing here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very different FTC depending on who wins the presidential election. Yeah, that's
Oh,
just the case.
you mean it as a, hey, let's get this done because we don't know who's going to win. I was thinking of it as a consumers are into this. That's
A variety of things.
okay.
Consumers are into this. You have certain stakeholders here in the House and the Senate who may be who are retiring. So you're not going to necessarily even have the same people have the same votes next session. So, you know, there's a lot of ephemeral pieces here and motivators to try and get something done. And the question is whether there is enough criticism that tanks it or not.
Mm, awesome. Well, we keep saying like we think it's going to get boring, and it never does. The whole
Never,
process.
never.
So, hey, I appreciate talking to you about this.
Yeah, of course. Good seeing your
Okay.
pink background. Now I feel like plenty of pizzazz.
Thanks. Well, you know, that's how we're feeling. Thanks, Alysa.
All right, see ya.